He hadn't expected to stay in the house alone for more than a few days, perhaps a week at most, and the idea of isolation didn't trouble him at first. If anything, it felt like a welcome interruption to the relentless rhythm of his previous life, which had grown so predictably fast-paced that stillness had become a kind of craving. The house belonged to his brother, recently relocated for work, who had asked him to stay while the renovations wrapped up, to keep things in order, to be a presence among walls that had been too long without one. It was an old place, 2 stories high, with a narrow staircase and crooked baseboards, built before symmetry had become a priority, and with a silence that felt structural, embedded in the beams, pressed into the floor, collected like dust in corners no one ever cleaned. The clocks were the first thing he noticed. There were 5 in total, 1 on the kitchen wall, 2 small ones in the bedrooms, 1 on the mantel above the empty fireplace, and a large freestanding grandfather clock in the hallway, which ticked faintly and seemed, at times, to echo longer than it should have. On the second morning, when he woke late and found the kitchen clock 10 minutes behind his phone, he assumed it had simply stalled, battery or age or something else forgettable. But when he checked again in the evening, it had fallen further behind. Exactly 10 more minutes. He replaced the battery, reset the time, and forgot about it. The next day, it was 20 minutes slow. He began checking the others. Every clock in the house lagged behind real time, all by the same precise increment, 1 additional minute lost per day, measured not from their starting points but from the passage of time itself. It was as though the house resisted the idea of now, pulling itself gently backward by degrees, minute by minute, refusing to let the present settle into place. He tried not to dwell on it. It was easy, at first, just check his phone, use his watch, ignore the subtle wrongness of the tick-tick-tick that seemed to stretch longer between beats. But the more he ignored it, the more it pressed in. The sound of the grandfather clock deepened, its pendulum slower, heavier, taking more effort to return to center. The clock's faces seemed dimmer each morning, not darker in color but less distinct, as if the markings were being slowly absorbed by the glass. The rooms began to feel stretched. Not visibly, not in any measurable way, the walls didn't move, the furniture didn't shift, but the spaces between objects grew uncertain. It took longer to cross from one end of the living room to the other, even though his steps didn't change. He once reached for a cup and hesitated mid-motion, convinced his hand took just slightly longer to arrive than it should have. Sleep followed the same pattern. Nights extended unnaturally, hours slipping by in silence, with dreams that grew longer and less structured, until he could no longer tell whether he was dreaming or simply floating in the slowed rhythm of the house. He would wake, not refreshed, but aged, and stare at the ceiling while the walls held their breath around him. He began marking time manually, making notes in a journal, the precise moment he heard the morning birds, the minute the light touched the stairs, the duration of boiling water, and each day, the measurements became harder to align. The natural world outside the windows remained consistent, but inside the house, time no longer behaved. The stove clock failed completely by the end of the week, frozen at 4:12 a.m. The mantel clock chimed 13 times one night and then fell silent forever. And yet, nothing ever felt sudden. It was all gradual. Gentle. Like being carried slowly backward into something that had been waiting too long to be remembered. And in the spaces between the seconds, he began to feel watched. He began forgetting how long he'd been in the house, not because he wasn't keeping track. He continued making notes, drawing tallies, sketching crude timelines across the margins of his journal, but because the act of recording itself began to lose meaning in a space where time no longer adhered to continuity. He would start a sentence and find, midway through, that he no longer remembered what day it was, or whether it had been light or dark when he picked up the pen, and the handwriting itself, though recognizably his, seemed stretched somehow, the letters pulled wider, the ink fainter toward the right side of the page, as if the words were being drawn into some unseen horizon just past the margin. He tried to stay grounded in routine, performing simple acts, making tea, walking the hallway, sitting in silence and counting heartbeats, but even those began to unravel. The kettle took longer to boil, not just perceptually but truly. He timed it again and found the process extending by minutes each day, as if heat itself resisted acceleration. Light bulbs dimmed more quickly, batteries drained without use, and the hallway between the bedroom and the staircase seemed to shift in length depending on the hour, or perhaps depending on him. It was in that hallway where he first sensed the figure. Not seen, not heard, but sensed, not with instinct or fear, but with a kind of inner recognition that something else had entered the rhythm of the house, something that did not announce itself but simply began to be there. He never saw it fully, only the suggestion of form where there should have been none, a distortion near the base of the grandfather clock, a darker shadow where two walls met, a ripple across the glass of the hallway mirror when he passed by too quickly to confirm whether it had moved.